All right, I think we can probably get started and we might have some folks trickling in. Welcome everyone to this webinar on the poison pipeline. Excited to have you with us. My name is Mireille Bajani. I'm the co-executive director of Slingshot, which is a regional environmental justice organization that works alongside communities most impacted by environmental health threats to take aim at polluters and build community power. We work closely with Just Zero on a number of issues. And I'm excited to be joined today by some awesome panelists. We have Gretchen Salter, who's the policy director at Safer States, Bobby Wilding, the executive director of Clean and Healthy, and Laura Orlando, the senior scientist at Just Zero. We are going to jump into some questions that I have for the panelists before we get into a Q&A with the audience. So some housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded. We will have time for questions from the audience. As I mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. So you should see that button at the bottom of your screen. And we do have links to the websites that all of our panelists here are from, websites of the organizations that all of our panelists are from in the resources button at the bottom. There's an option for speakers. So if you go there, you can learn more about all of our organizations. And also in that resources menu, there are lots of fantastic links to resources that the panelists will be mentioning today. And Heather will also be, I believe, dropping those links in the chat throughout the panel. So you'll have plenty of opportunities to learn more coming out of our discussion. So today we're talking about the poison pipeline, how toxic products become waste and then pollution and how they impact human health and what zero waste policy and community actions can do to stop it at the source. So to jump right in, I'll ask our panelists the first question: what keeps you up at night about this poison pipeline? And I'll start with Bobby.
I'm Bobby Wilding, Executive Director at Clean and Healthy. And I think the thing that keeps me up most at night is just how little we really know about all of the chemicals that can harm our health and the environment, and where they are in our products. So we talk about PFAS forever chemicals. And, I think even though I could rattle off a long list of their uses, I still don't know where all of them are. We don't know where all of them are. And so it's very hard, I think, when you start from the products place, like in the pipeline. I always am starting by thinking about where those chemicals get manufactured in the first place. And we just, without all that information, if we start encountering things as products, we have no idea. I learn new things every day about places that harmful chemicals are hiding. And then when we want to think about moving through not, to a zero waste space, it becomes so much harder to ensure that we're not just sort of re-inflicting harm on people when we recycle products or reuse materials. And that challenge is something that I think is really takes a lot of reckoning, and it's what it keeps me awake.
Definitely lots of scary stuff there. Thanks for sharing, Bobby. I'll go to Gretchen next, and then we'll round it out with Laura.
Sure. Thanks so much. I am the policy director here at Safer States. And in addition to what keeps Bobby up at night, what keeps me up at night is the life cycle impact of plastic and the false solutions that are being purported to solve the plastic crisis. And so what I mean by that, first of all, the life cycle impacts. I think when a lot of people think about plastic and the plastic harms on our health, they really are only thinking about end of life considerations around plastics and are just thinking about what do we do with plastic waste, but they're not thinking about the manufacturing, the drilling of the oil that is required for plastics, the manufacturing of plastics and petrochemical facilities, and what that is doing to the neighboring communities. And as a result, since pollution knows no boundaries to all of us, the use of plastics and the microplastics that are coming off our carpets, our furniture, our clothing, all of the plastic that's around us. And then finally, those end of life considerations. Bobby mentioned a little bit about this whole idea of recycling, that recycled content could save us. And I think a lot of people are really well intentioned when they think that recycling is the solution to plastic waste, and it just really isn't. Most plastic can't be recycled. And if you think about all the chemical additives that have to be added into plastics, even those plastics that can be recycled, those additives are going back into that recycling stream, plus more additives are being put on top of it. And then this new kind of false solution that is starting to take hold called advanced recycling or chemical recycling, which is really just a fancy way of saying burning plastic for fuel, and how that's being touted as the solution. And so, you see it all over when you go, shopping and you see, oh my gosh, made with recycled content, but nobody really stops to think about what that actually means for the long-term effects on our health. As a lot of people like to say, I am the fun police. As Bobby says, she can ruin anybody's day. And so I'm sorry if we just ruined yours.
We will have some more positive, actions folks can take later on in the
Great.
conversation. So we won't just leave folks feeling stuck in facing these problems, but definitely important to fully understand the scope of the problems first.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Laura Orlando, senior scientist at Just Zero. What keeps me up but fires me up and fuels my work is how invisible the poison pipelines are and the lack of accountability for the polluters, the way toxic chemicals move silently through our economy from industrial production to consumer goods to waste systems. And finally, unfortunately, into our soil, water, and bodies. But so much of this contamination is entirely preventable. I know that's the part of the work of everyone on this panel is grounded in prevention. And corporations are still legally allowed to manufacture and discharge PFAS and other poisons, so many other poisons, while communities, especially low income and rural ones, are left to deal with the consequences. And, we should remember this is not just an environmental issue, it's a public health crisis and a moral failure.
Definitely. Thank you for highlighting that. Thanks all for your responses. Um, we see this all the time in our campaigns at Slingshot, working with impacted communities, that polluters are often not held accountable and decisions are made far from communities most affected, whether it's PFAS contamination, as you mentioned, Laura, or plastics, as you mentioned, Gretchen. And today, part of what this conversation is about is connecting those upstream decisions and policies to downstream pollution and community action. So I'd love to shift into digging into the question, how do toxics move through the waste system, and what are the pressure points where policy matters? I'll start with Gretchen this time.
So, I mean, I already mentioned kind of the life cycle of plastics. That's really the life cycle of all the petrochemicals that we are talking about. It starts first and foremost with, drilling or fracking or however we're going to get these the petrochemical feedstocks that or the oil feedstocks that lead into petrochemicals. And at every single stage of production, from drilling, from manufacturing of the chemicals to manufacture of the product, to transportation of the product, as we've seen with transport accidents, to use of the product, to disposal, those chemicals are coming out into, into our society. But there are pressure points all along that. And so Safer States really focuses a lot on state policy because we really believe that states have the opportunity and the authority and the ability to actually enact policies far quicker and far more sweeping than we can at the federal level. And we've seen that with PFAS. When we started working on PFAS in 2018, really nobody had a hope that PFAS would get out of products as quickly as it has. But because states took action first and foremost on firefighting foam, getting PFAS out of firefighting foam, which is probably the number one, at the time was the number one water contaminant, taking it out of textiles, carpeting, clothing, food packaging. We're reducing the demand for PFAS in those products and therefore reducing it in our society. And so certainly there's that demand side strategy of trying to get it out of consumer products. But then there are other pressure points there too. And so we're starting to see states now tackle things like discharge limits. I'm sure Laura's going to talk a little bit more about sludge and biosolids and kind of where those pressure points are. So at every stage of the manufacture, even in, state policy that might not be able to control, drilling or the manufacturing of chemical, there are other points where you can actually place pressure. And we've done so and we've won and we're actually making progress.
Thanks, Gretchen. Laura or Bobby, who wants to jump in next?
I can jump in. I think I just would echo what Gretchen said. I think that the way we can have the biggest impact is finding the opportunities to turn off the tap, so we're making different decisions up front. Because by the time you end up with something like the solids from a wastewater treatment plant or a landfill that's leaking or any of those things, those problems were created right there. They're so far upstream. And I think what we see industry really likes to do is try to solve those downstream problems because it allows them to continue business as usual. But there really are a lot of ways, both using policy at the state level, but also things that can be decided at the local level. A lot of reuse policies work best at a local level, so you can start driving towards, say, stainless steel reusable containers for takeout instead of single-use plastics, things like that. Institutional decisions can drive a lot of change because that's also a place where you can make changes in what you're procuring and how you're handling your products to, again, move. Like, I think a lot of the zero waste and reuse approaches do a lot to turn off the tap on toxics if they're designed well, right? If you're not just sort of like replacing a single-use plastic with a reusable plastic. But there's a lot of opportunity, I think, at those places. We can't control necessarily what's happening on a global scale by trying to mandate changes in production, but we can push the decisions back upstream with those decisions at the use and policies around what are in products.
Thanks, Bobby. Laura?
Yeah, I concur. Toxics move through every stage of the waste system, right? From production and use to disposal, through fake recycling, like chemical recycling. For example, PFAS from industrial dischargers and consumer products enter wastewater treatment plants that aren't designed, nor can they be designed to remove them. And these forever chemicals and thousands of other contaminants like microplastics and endocrine disruptors then end up in the sewage sludge, which is an unwanted byproduct of wastewater treatment, and is then spread on farmland through completely misguided federal and state policies. And they also end up in the treated wastewater, also called the effluent, discharged into rivers, lakes, and oceans, or in incinerator ash if the stuff is burned. And, the key policy pressure points are source reduction, stopping chemical use and discharge at the manufacturing stage. Why are we still manufacturing PFAS? Why do we have single-use plastics? Product design, green chemistry, that's out there. We need to ban and substitute harmful chemicals before they enter the marketplace. And we know how to do that. We know how to do that in many, many, many circumstances. Waste treatment and disposal. The policies around waste treatment and disposal are really broken, but we can fix them. State regulations that close routes of contamination, like state sludge regulations. Maine is a beacon, a really great place to look for effective state regulations that protect farmland, protect farmers, protect Maine food and water by banning the land application of sewage sludge. And, this is where environmental health and environmental justice meet. Prevention through regulation and action is way more effective than any attempt at downstream cleanup. Downstream cleanup as much as we want to do, it often becomes just another chance for the polluters to make, put more money in their pockets. And collective action, unite, join or otherwise support the organizations on this panel and others working towards safer policies and practices. It's collective action that's going to really, really move the needle.
Thanks, Laura. I have a little bit of a follow-up. The organizer in me is always thinking about power dynamics and why, you mentioned that, why are we still manufacturing PFAS? Why are we know how to shut these things down? Why is this the world that we still live in?
Can I jump in?
Mhm.
It's money, right? And there are trade associations and there are like fake organizations that exist to sort of mask the problem. So in New York, we're working on a packaging bill that would require source reduction and eliminating toxics, among other things. And the American Chemistry Council has spent millions of dollars. It was literally like the most funded lobbying bill in New York, aside from the New York State budget. It's like, out of the top 10 most expensive lobbied bills in the beginning of last year or this year, it was in the top 10. It was the only standalone bill that was in the top 10. This is a big money maker. And I think it's also just really important to remember that a lot of these toxic chemicals were created because they had wastes from other industrial processes that they didn't want to have to deal with as waste. So fluorine is a byproduct of other industrial processes. Chlorine is a byproduct of other industrial processes. And so it ends up being mixed with other petrochemicals. And even the other petrochemicals are often sort of byproducts of producing oil, producing fuel. And so
Mhm.
they have a huge financial incentive to push back against things that make sense for all of our health, for the health of the planet, and it's oftentimes that is what we are up against. And it really takes a lot of collective action to really overcome those moneyed interests.
Yeah.
I have to, I completely agree. And a mentor of mine, when you'd ask why are we, why are we kept up at night by this? Why are we getting sick from these, why are these polluters in control? He would say, follow the money. And
Mhm.
I think if we follow the money, we can answer a lot of whys.
Yeah. Well, and also if you look at the reducing demand for gasoline and fossil fuels in the energy sector, chemicals and plastics is the relief valve for them and for the petrochemical industry. And so as demand for as we have more electric cars and everyone's trying to reduce emissions, they still have to meet their bottom line. And so that's why we're seeing even more plastic, even more petrochemicals coming onto the market. And but the thing is that they're actually really scared. And so, I don't know if you've seen these ads that have been running, the one ran during the Super Bowl last year, trying to scare people into loving plastic, where there was a couple the woman was pregnant and they go into the hospital and it's empty, and there's somebody says, welcome to the hospital. You can't have a baby because everything with plastic has been banned. Um, and so it's these fear tactics and scare tactics. And coming from doing this work for so many years and also prior to that electoral politics, when somebody launches a negative ad and is trying to scare you, they're the ones who are actually scared themselves because there are enough people who now know that this is a problem and collective action is happening. And so we just have to keep our foot on the gas. Sorry for the bad metaphor there, and keep going because I do think at some point, we will see a change, but we're not going to see it unless we all work together.
Definitely. Thank you all for sharing. Following the money is always a good practice. I know sometimes it can feel obvious, but it's good to put a point, a finer point on why our systems are failing us right now, why these polluters are continuing to get away with this. And a slogan kind of that one of my organizing peers said early on in my organizing is, they've got money, we've got people. And that's how we move forward and continue, and with that collective action, as y'all were mentioning. So digging into that, let's talk about zero waste policies that work. Can you give me an example of a zero waste policy that prioritizes prevention over pollution? And what are some false solutions in contrast? Bobby, do you want to start?
I mean, I think that, you know, when I was just talking to a lobbyist at an event last night who works for a recycling entity, and she and I were sort of talking past each other a little bit about um, the fact that toxic chemicals in products make it not possible to recycle. I do think that the kinds of policies that turn off the tap on toxics make it easier to do reuse and to the extent that recycling is possible, like turning things, just anything in that circular economy process requires taking toxics out. And I think that that's a really important thing. And we are winning at it. We're winning at it so well, as Gretchen mentioned, that, the American Chemistry Council is whining to the Department of Justice about this and trying to use interstate commerce as some way of defeating us because we are winning at that. And we know that when we change laws at state levels where we do have a lot of power, that it has a ripple effect that is much broader. And I think it also then creates the space for driving those safer alternatives that can then be used in other kinds of successful zero waste policies that focus on reuse and, safer, long-term, more durable materials.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I think, you know, reuse is such a great policy because I think for a lot of times it's important um, to enact laws that don't allow certain toxic chemicals in our products, but a lot of times we want to pair that don't with the do, right? And so we want to be able to offer a vision of a hopeful future and what we want instead. And so enacting reuse policies, whether they be at the local level, like simple things like skip the stuff, which is, no single use for on-site dining or takeout dining, unless it's upon request, to larger kind of reuse policies where, large institutions or stadiums are enacting reuse policies. Um, they do decrease the amount of, for lack of a better term, stuff that's out there and those toxic chemicals. So I think those are incredibly important. Um, and I think one of the things that we want to just be really clear on is I think in some ways I've seen legislators and some environmental policies try to be too cute in the sense of like, well, we're going to enact different market forces to try to push our way into these policies. And a lot of times those are riddled with loopholes that are very easy for industries to try to just kind of go ahead and skate through. So I think the policies that work best are the policies that say exactly what we want. If we want less waste, then we say we want a policy that reduces waste, that has source reduction elements. If we want fewer toxic chemicals, then we pass policies naming those toxics or the characteristics of those toxics and say those cannot be allowed anymore. Trying to sort of back our way through economic incentives might be part of the plan, but that will never get us to the actual solve.
Thanks. Laura, do you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's several examples. I can think of three off the bat that Just Zero works on: extended producer responsibility for packaging. When it's well designed, it makes corporations responsible for the full life cycle of their products, which creates incentives to reduce waste and eliminate toxins or toxic additives. By contrast, Gretchen mentioned this, but chemical recycling, it's a classic fault solution. Let's just burn plastic. Not ever a good idea. It's plastic incineration rebranded as advanced recycling, total greenwashing. Just like biosolids recycling. Biosolids is a industry public relations term for sewage sludge, a byproduct of wastewater treatment, always has PFAS in it, always has uh, just hundreds and hundreds of other poisons in it. And spreading poison-laden sludge on farmlands, not recycling. It's a pollution transfer scheme. Another one is preventing food waste from going to landfills. Great policy. Approximately 30% of what goes into landfills is food waste in urban environments. from cities. And, instead of sending it to the landfill where it contributes to greenhouse gases like methane, we can turn it into compost. That's a real solution. Co-digestion, which is a fancy term for doing something really bad with at least co-digestion of food waste in at wastewater treatment plants, is a really bad idea, where food waste is collected ostensibly under compost programs, for instance, in New York City and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that food waste is ground up at a central facility and then trucked to a wastewater treatment plant where this slurry is added to an anaerobic digester, causing more pollution, more toxic sewage sludge, and creates zero compost. It's just a really bad idea. But it puts money in corporate pockets that don't want that money taken out.
Yeah.
Can I just say that there's at least in New York State and probably in other states as well, our Department of Environmental Conservation creates what are called beneficial use determinations for certain materials. And mostly it's exactly what Laura just said. It's a pollution transfer scheme where you say, okay, we've got a problem with waste tires, for example. We're going to ground them up and we're going to turn them into the crumb rubber for AstroTurf, or we're going to make them into the playground surfaces for children to play on. Tires were made to be tires. They were never intended to be up close and personal with our bodies. And so those chemicals end up being in places we never expected. And I think that that's sewage sludge, land spreading of sewage sludge falls into that category of beneficial use determinations. And I would argue that in the vast majority of cases, they are just pollution transfer schemes that we need to be looking at upstream to solve the problems of those toxics so that there could possibly be a reuse. But while we're poisoning those materials, we're basically then just extending that poison.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just add one more thing that I forgot to mention. I think polluter pay is incredibly powerful. The notion that those who cause the problem should be responsible, not just for the cleanup, but for making communities whole again. And we are seeing this a lot with PFAS. PFAS is kind of one of the big, one of the biggest kind of polluter pay, not necessarily schemes, but campaigns that I've seen in all of my years of doing this. And most of this is just because people are realizing that PFAS is in their drinking water. Local agencies and states have had to spend millions of dollars. Eventually, it'll end up being billions of dollars on cleaning up PFAS for a problem that they didn't create. And so where we're seeing it right now is a number of attorneys general across, I think over 30 states at this point have sued the manufacturers of PFAS to recoup some of those costs. But I do think enacting policies that actually require polluters to pay is a very effective tool. And if it weren't, again, they wouldn't be fighting it so hard. So Vermont passed a policy a couple of years ago requiring a greenhouse gas fund to pay for climate mitigation, because I don't know if folks have followed the flooding that has happened in Vermont every single year for the past few years, but their capital city was just underwater. It looked like a lake for a couple of years now. This has happened. And so, Vermont can't afford to constantly be cleaning up. So they passed this law requiring oil companies and chemical manufacturers to pay into this fund. And of course, they're fighting it really, really hard. And the reason they are is because it's effective. So if there is a way that we can get at them and make it too expensive, Bobby talked about like the fact that there's a lot of money, but follow the money. Poisoning the planet is incredibly profitable, right? There is a lot of money, and even the awards that we have gotten from these PFAS lawsuit, they are dwarfed in comparison to the amount of money that 3M and DuPont and Chemours has made over the decades of producing PFAS. And so if you enact polluter pay policies, they have to be enough to hurt, right? They have to be enough to make the value proposition of producing toxic chemicals, that balance has to shift. So I think those are policies that I think we're probably going to be seeing, hopefully in the future.
Thanks for underlining that, Gretchen. I want to give a quick reminder to folks, we are going to take Q&A from the audience after we wrap up the panel section. Some questions have come in through the Q&A. If you have questions, drop them in the Q&A box and we'll be sure to be monitoring that. Would love to hear from you all about a campaign that you're working on to help plug the poison pipeline. If you can give one example each. Gretchen, do you want to start?
We've talked a lot about PFAS, and so Safer States has been working on PFAS policy for a number of years with a number of our allied states, getting PFAS out of consumer products. But we really see PFAS as the tip of the iceberg, and that's, a really good storytelling tool. But there are a lot of other toxic chemicals that people don't know about, or that we even don't know about. And so we are really pushing for things like transparency, making sure that we understand what's in our products and the health harms that they can cause, eliminating the worst chemicals, and advancing safer solutions. And so you do have a number of states who are introducing and passing policies that do just that, requiring transparency, eliminating the worst, and investing in and promoting safer solutions. So that's really at the core of everything that we are doing right now.
Thanks. Laura, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. At Just Zero, we've created a number of toolkits. There's 7 of them, but 2 that come to mind in this conversation and dovetail with some of the things we've been talking about are a food waste toolkit and a sewage sludge prevention toolkit. And the sludge toolkit, what it does is it helps both of them, and all of them, I should say, help communities. It's a framework for shaping laws that meet the community's goals and needs. So if your goal is to ban the land application of sewage sludge and support farmers and farm families that have been impacted by sludge and the neighbors that have been impacted by sludge, there's language and strategies that one can incorporate without reinventing the wheel. And this is taken from best practices. It's taken from real collaboration with people across the country to get this to try to really fashion these toolkits so they meet the needs of people trying to prevent pollution, plug the pipelines. One of the things that we've done is we helped establish a new coalition called the Coalition for Sludge-Free Land. And that's a national coalition of organizations united to end land application of sludge and stop the spread of PFAS and other pollutants that always follow in its wake. So, there are a lot of ways we can unite to plug the pipelines, to get rid of the pipelines. And I'm just so glad to hear what Bobby and Gretchen are doing. And I hope you share in the question and answers what y'all are doing out there.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Bobby, you want to round us out with the campaign you're working on?
Yeah, so just to give some specific examples of things that we're doing in New York that align with what Gretchen outlined sort of broadly on safer states, we have a bill that is actually before Governor Hochul right now, needs to get signed, that would ban PFAS and other toxic chemicals in period products, which has a whole host of benefits beyond just the person who's using those products. Obviously, a lot of those get flushed down toilets, they get sent to landfills. And so we have that waste stream. But that is a bill that follows from a transparency bill that we required. New York was the first state to require on package labeling of ingredients in period products. And it actually drove companies to stop putting fragrance in because they didn't want to have to tell us what was in the fragrance. So that was a huge step for all of us who have to use those products every month to move that forward. So those are some examples. We also have a bill that passed our New York State Senate and is very close in the Assembly to ban PFAS and other toxic chemicals in personal care and cosmetics. And that was built specifically around the kinds of chemicals that disproportionately are harming women of color. And so there's sort of a very strong environmental justice frame to our Beauty Justice Act. And we also work to, the state has a procurement policy, a green purchasing policy, and we work to make sure that they're producing specifications that include in all of the various things they're considering about different products, toxics, and also avoiding other things like reducing plastics, pushing towards reuse rather than or refill for containers, things like that. And so I think there's also a lot of leverage in procurement policies that change how institutions, whether they're government or others, are making those decisions that can have a real impact on plugging the toxic pipeline or turning off the tap, which is my favorite approach.
Definitely. Thank you all for sharing. We'll do one last question, I think, from the panelists before we pivot to the audience Q&A. And want to ask you all, or we'll start with Laura and Bobby and Gretchen, if you want to weigh in too, you're welcome to. What are some of the environmental and public health implications of not stopping or at least slowing down this pollution pipeline that we've been outlining?
Failing to act means more poisons in people and ecosystems, more PFAS in breast milk, fish, drinking water, more hormone disruption, cancers, immune disorders, more contaminated farmland that poisons farmers and can no longer produce safe food. Environmentally, it means we're contaminating our life support system, soil, water, air. Economically, it locks communities into, perpetual cleanup while the polluters profit. And politically, it deepens inequity. Frontline and indigenous communities already overburdened by pollution continue to bear the brunt. Several years ago, I wrote an article for Ms. Magazine about whether it mattered to climate change, whether whether you turned off a light or not. It seems like such a, I don't know how many. It's not a lot of electricity if you turn off the light or you leave it on. But what I conclude is if it connects you to climate change, if that action connects you to the politics and the policies and gets you thinking about it and gets you acting, then it matters a whole lot. So, failing to act matters, and acting, even in the smallest act, can connect us to solutions.
Laura?
Yeah, I'll just add, sicker people, unsafe water, unsafe air, and we're actually nearing a global tipping point when it comes to chemicals. I think a lot is talked about and written about, and rightly so, on climate, that we are near that global tipping point on climate. Same is true of chemicals. We are almost past the point where our planet can manage the number of dangerous chemicals and untested chemicals that are coming into the environment. And so this is something that needs urgent action. This is not something that we can just say, well, let's fix climate first. Gosh, I can't do two global crises. I'm sorry, we have to. But the thing is that they're interconnected. And so when we fix one, we fix the other. And so, as Laura said, small actions are really important. Collective action is probably the most important.
Definitely. On that note, there are folks who have asked questions along those lines in the Q&A, and we're going to dig into some of them. I might combine some questions that folks asked. But one question asked was, are there any ways in which individuals can protect themselves from these toxics? We've been outlining all these, ways that toxics can impact us. So would love to hear, what can people do on that front?
I would say that I often talk with folks about the fact that we can't really shop our way out of this problem. That as individuals, I think there are things, and I'll bring them up, but I also think that it's important for folks to not feel like it's their burden to change becoming toxicologists and perfect your home. I definitely think there are choices we can make that are safer, but really, as Laura said, connecting that to the broader change is really what will fuel us. So I always encourage people to get involved with political activity, like legislative policy change, because that's what protects everybody. But you can do things like choosing things that are more inert, like glass and stainless steel in the kitchen, as opposed to plastic or Teflon, right? You can use, there are a number of different apps out there that you can use to screen your personal care products. The one that my family uses is called Yuka. Other people like Clearia, but both of them will let you know, it'll like interpret the ingredients in products for you. Um, so that you can find safer materials, choosing more plant-based solutions for clothes like cotton, not falling, victim to the marketing schemes of recycled jeans. I think when you get down to it, you can turn fabric fibers into different things, but once you add plastic into it, it's not actually like something that has an ongoing life cycle of recycling. It's just like a once and now what do we do with it, right? Like I think that those are important solutions to look at. But there definitely are where, the things that matter to you, you can choose, definitely don't store your food in plastic is a key thing, I would say. But there are definitely a lot of tips, and there are a lot of websites that are happy to tell you about how to do that kind of personal change. But again, I think it's really important not to let that drive you crazy, because there's this pressure right now for us to be sort of chemical perfectionists. And we walk out the door and the rest of the world is still the rest of the world. And even, I've been doing this work for 25 years or more, and I learn something new every day. If I carried guilt for choices I've made, it would drive me insane. And so I just want to encourage folks to both think about what you can do, but also recognize that this is not a problem you created and you can be part of that broader solution.
Mhm.
Definitely. Thanks, Bobby.
Here, here. I mean, I just so agree with you. The burden is not on the individual. And these are not lifestyle choices that are poisoning our planet. These are economic choices. These are policy choices. Um, we need to get in charge instead of having the polluters in charge, and we need to reverse that. And we can do that through collective action. Um, Everyone on this panel their organizations are uniting people, educating people, helping people figure out how to act. I encourage everyone to look at the resources that have been posted and look into Slingshot, Clean and Healthy, Safer States, Just Zero. And there are many others. Environmental Working Group publishes information about products and their safety. Uh, if you can eat organic or know your farmer, where you're getting your food. I know that's certainly not possible for lots and lots of people, but if you can, the organic regulations forbid the use of sewage sludge, for example. It's one way to help protect yourself. But, again, I completely agree with Bobby. Don't carry this on your shoulders as some guilt that you're not doing the right thing for your family. And when you can avoid plastics, avoid them. Don't put your plastic in the microwave. There's a long list of these things that individuals can do to help protect themselves, but it's collective action that's going to really protect all of us.
Yeah, definitely. A quick follow-up on that, because we had a more specific question. If maybe one of you can answer, what materials are best for food providers to use in lieu of plastic for products like fresh greens? Even organic producers are using plastics.
So, so we're talking about a food producer, not necessarily a restaurant. So if we're talking about, fresh greens, I mean, I'm really not the expert on food production and the food safety rules, but I always love going to the store and just picking up my apple and my fresh greens, just being able to like pick it out of the bin and then put it in the material that I bring and carry home. I know that there are a lot of different pressures on food producers around safety. But the thing that drives me the most crazy is when I want to get a pack of apples and I can't buy them outside of a plastic bag, and I just want to pick my apples out on my own. And so, as much as we can do that, I think certainly for for restaurants and for on-site dining, we really are encouraging things like ceramic, stainless steel for on-site dining as much as possible. Being part of a reuse system where you either encourage people to bring their own reusable reusables, or you provide reusables in convenient places for people to be able to drop them off when they're done with them for takeout. Those systems are starting to pop up around the country, and there's some really interesting, great pilot projects that are happening in places like Galveston and soon to be launched in Hilo, Hawaii. And and so I think more will be coming online very quickly. So as soon as those come online, join that movement and join that process to encourage reuse as much as possible. I know Laura, Bobby, do you have anything else around the fresh food ideas?
I might keep us moving because we've got a few more questions, but
Okay.
I want to try to get to, but appreciate that answer, Gretchen.
You,
And
you covered a lot of it, Gretchen.
We got a few questions related to, because it was mentioned, the importance of compost, things that could be composted not going to waste or water treatment, so how do we confirm if the local compost or recycling company is sending waste to the water treatment plants or landfill? And if confirmed, what can we do to stop it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can answer that. Call the compost company. My food scraps are picked up by a company that serves the greater Boston area called Black Earth. Black Earth really composts the food, and they will be quick to tell you they've got nothing to do with the wastewater treatment plant and that they don't agree with that practice. If you call the city of Cambridge, Department of Public Works, you'll hear a different story. Yes, they do. They'll tell you that they send some portion of they send all of their food waste to a wastewater treatment plant in Massachusetts. Ask. So ask and be persistent like you would for anything else where you want to really find the answer. You might get bumped from, the Department of Public Works to the sanitation department or whatever, but keep asking because you're a taxpayer, you're paying for those programs. Or you're paying a company like Black Earth to do this good work. So ask. What can you do about it? Tell them to stop. Put pressure on them as an individual. Switch. If you're in a town that's sending their food scraps to a sewer, um, investigate working with a private company that's really doing composting, or if you can, compost in your backyard. And sometimes it's a real mixed bag. In Boston, some of the food scraps go to the sewer and some are being composted. So the pressure there is to get 100% of it composted and get the city to fess up to how much of it is going to the sewer and help us understand why that choice is being made. It's certainly not a choice that's good um, for soil. It doesn't provide any nutrients and it creates more poisons.
Definitely. Thanks, Laura. Um, Another question. There has been a lot of coverage on how corporations started changing their product design to reduce waste and remove toxics from their products in Europe and other countries. What is the sticking point here in the US that the same corporations refuse to make those changes here?
Bobby, you take this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things is that there are stronger laws in the European Union and other countries. And my theory is that part of the reason they have those laws is because the state pays for people's health care. And so you've got a place where the taxpayers are covering the health of the nation, which means that they actually have incentives to reduce toxic loads on a much larger scale. Um, and oftentimes, again, it's cheaper to make toxic stuff. And so we end up being on the bottom end of a double standard. We tell ourselves the story that, of American exceptionalism, but the fact is that we are really good at giving power to chemical companies. They have a lot of say in international negotiations. They have a lot of say on Capitol Hill. And I think they have a different amount of power here in the US than in other countries. So I feel like that's a huge there's a huge connection across that. I think that we don't really think about the ripple effects of what a single payer healthcare system would mean for our country, and what kind of priorities that we might see if we were looking at the actual, real cost that all of those companies are shifting from themselves so they can increase their profits and putting on our backs when we have to deal with things like cancer or infertility or other health problems.
Boy, that's such a great point, Bobby. Um, yeah, that's so true. And another thing is policy. It's one of the reasons I know at Just Zero we focus on policy and advocacy as one of their uh, key areas of interest. And in Europe, there's a policy, EU has a regulation rather called REACH, and it means registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. And companies have to register the substances they manufacture, and it's guilty until proven innocent, unlike US policy, which is innocent until proven guilty when it comes to chemicals. And it makes a really big difference. It's not perfect, right? But it places responsibility on the industry to prove that chemicals are safe to use. And, you know, there are a lot of good ideas for policies like REACH in the United States, and we need to start getting serious about that because policy action is one way to intervene and protect public health.
Yeah. And I think if you just go back to the money question, how are elections funded in the EU? How are elections funded here? That
Definitely.
makes a lot of this is following the money, and you get to a lot of different solutions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've got two more I hope we can get to quickly, and then I want to wrap up with a question for all of you to answer to close us out. But so hopefully some quicker responses from maybe one or two of you for these. A community in Connecticut recently found significantly elevated PFAS levels in wells in one area of town. The Department of Environmental Protection is providing filtration for a year, but as of now, it seems the burden will then fall to homeowners and residents. Do you have any suggestions or lessons learned for those in this difficult situation?
Yeah, so I'll say the state of Maine, as Laura pointed out, has been a leader on PFAS. And one of the things that they've done is created a fund for farmers who have been really had to shutter their farms because of PFAS contamination. And so I would really suggest reaching out to the policymakers, your representatives in Connecticut, to see if some sort of fund could be established for permanent clean water for that community. I know that there are other places that have provided that. I can't think off the top of my head, unfortunately, right now, if Laura or Bobby, if you can think of it. But that is probably the best part, the best solution that I could come up with. A really good solution is actually putting a fee on PFAS manufacturers to pay into a fund that would actually provide clean water while they actually clean up the wells and the source water for the wells.
Yeah, the maintenance for a point of entry system, which means all the water in the household is has, for instance, a carbon activated filter on it, can cost as much as $5,000 a year to maintain. And it's not right to put that burden on somebody that didn't invite that pollution into their onto their property. But here they are burdened with it. And so Maine's a great example. Maine picks up that cost. The state of Maine not only picks up the cost for maintenance, but they do inspections, and it's not inconsequential. And so we need to, I think making the polluters pay is a great idea. Wherein the polluters have paid to direct some of that money towards this kind of cleanup, often is directed towards water treatment plants, which have they're public systems, but rural communities in peri-urban communities that are, households that are non-public water systems have private wells. And the burden falls on them to test the water, to clean the water, and to pay for any maintenance. And we need to shift that.
Definitely. Thanks, Laura. Last quick question before the final round. One person asked, are there concerns about compost bins that are made of plastic?
I think probably yes for microplastics, right? And the leaching, we don't really know. Even when something's labeled with like a number on it, which is not the case, I think, for the plastic that your recycled, your compost bin's going to be. But even that isn't like a full ingredient list. That's just like the major source of the material. So I think composting and things that aren't plastic, just like you wouldn't want to store your food in things that are plastic, right? Makes sense to move away from.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Goodwill and found a really cool pot, a metal pot that I use for my food scraps on the counter. And
Mhm.
then that goes into a plastic bin that the company that deals with my compost provides, but it's lined. I put a liner on it of a compostable bag, and I trust that's not made out of plastic. And so, because we all know plastic isn't compostable. Um, and so that's way, like as an individual, I try to avoid that, the
Yeah.
incursions of plastics into my wonderful, wonderful food scraps, which will become wonderful, even more wonderful compost.
Great. I'm going to jump in with our last question because we're running short on time here. So we'd love for all of you to answer at least briefly. Um, what are tips you can give people and communities engaged in plugging this poison pipeline, whether they're, whether it's industry pushback, messaging to counter greenwashing, pushing back on false solutions, dissecting a lot of the, the words that are put out there, the fancy words like advanced recycling, whatever else.
Mhm.
What are tips you have as people are going out into the world and trying to, fight this problem?
I would say that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's likely someone else who's already doing a lot of this. And so working in coalition and connecting up with both other groups like yours that are going through the same things, and also finding, coalitions in your state or other organizations that are doing work that's related to you. I think that's how we win. We don't Clean and Healthy doesn't win our victories because Clean and Healthy does our work. We're a small organization, but we work together with lots of other organizations from different perspectives, and that's how we win. And I think that there's a lot of resources that you can bring to bear without having to become the expert on everything when you're in community.
Yeah, I would add to that, name the problem clearly. Don't let industry define the narrative. Follow the pipeline, connect the dots between production waste exposure, build coalitions, like Bobby said, partner with farmers and all kinds of other people, push for prevention, expose greenwashing, and, it, focus on justice, environmental justice, social justice. The goal isn't just less waste, it's cleaner air, safer food, healthier people.
Mhm. Yeah, and I'll just add to what Bobby and Laura already said. Finding that group, getting involved, and don't be intimidated, I think, to talk to lawmakers and people who make decisions. Remember that they work for us, right? And you are a far more effective advocate than anybody who does this professionally. And it is a different reception that you will get walking into a legislator's office or walking into any sort of decision maker's office than a professional lobbyist will. And so, the more of us that are actually taking action on this, then the higher likelihood is that we'll get these policies enacted.
Thanks, Gretchen. I love that message. That's something I talk about a lot in our community organizing with Slingshot, is that residents are experts in their own experience. People are often made to feel like they don't know enough to talk about the issue, but you know what you're experiencing in your community. You know what your neighbors are dealing with, what you need instead. And you should feel confident going out and sharing that story. Um, Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us. Thank you, Bobby, Gretchen, and Laura, for your expertise and answering these questions. Thank you to our audience for joining and for asking your great questions. Encourage you to join the remaining sessions of the Waste-Free Future Summit that Just Zero, this is part of that summit that Just Zero is holding. There's another session this afternoon on redefining zero waste, Just Zero's blueprint for bold systemic change. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.